In June of 1916, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien entered the trenches of World War I. 25 days later, the Battle of the Somme began, at the time the deadliest battle ever fought in human history. On its first day, one of Tolkien's closest school friends was killed in it. Roughly 21,000 other men also died that day. 119 days into the battle, Tolkien reported sick with trench fever. As autumn gave way to winter, his condition grew life-threatening. He was shipped back to England to recover, a transfer that just might have saved his life. A month later, his dearest friend in the whole world was killed by a stray shard of shrapnel, aged 22. Across the channel, Tolkien drifted in and out of feverish dreams. And there, in a crowded army hut filled with the crackle of gramophones, he began to write a story about a fall, about war and destruction and slaughter on an industrial scale. He wrote The Fall of Gondolin. Some might argue the most epic thing he would ever write. And that is the story it's finally time to tell. The last of the Silmarillion's three great tales. One of the defining stories of the Elder Days. Let's get started on the saga of Gondolin. Maya, Gul'van, and Melanine, and welcome to Gondolin. In the next episode, I will begin telling that story. I'll explain the origins of the hidden city, but as I like to do with these First Age series, I first want to lay the groundwork and talk a little bit about where this story came from, how it evolved, and why it matters so much within the arc of Tolkien's own life, as well as within his wider legendarium. And honestly, although the other two great tales of Beren and Luthien and the Children of Húrin do have fascinating origins of their own dating back to around the same period, the story of the hidden city of Gondolin is unlike any other. With Beren and Luthien, I made 10 episodes, each one telling roughly 1/10 of one story. Same with the Children of Húrin, except I think I took 13 episodes there. But things are going to work a little bit differently with Gondolin. Instead of one long self-contained story, this Gondolin series is really 4 separate but interconnected stories that together add up to a single 461-year-long epic. In some ways, I think you can think of the Great Tale of Gondolin as being like 1 year that's split into 4 seasons. I will begin this series in metaphorical winter, where the city and the story have their origins. Then we will move into spring, where we get new life and new characters and new stories. Then comes summer, where great things are going to happen and the story's really going to heat up. And then after summer comes the fall. But just like with the Children of Húrin, there is an awful lot more to this Gondolin story than just the 9 pages written towards the end of the Silmarillion. Unlike the Children of Húrin though, it's not so easy to stitch that extended edition together into one coherent novel-like narrative. And the reason for this is, just like the last story in this First Age series, the Silmaril of Doriath, Tolkien never truly finished the tale of Gondolin. Or perhaps I should say, he never truly finished revising and updating it. As I mentioned, the end of this story, the 4th season, the fall of the great city, is the part that Tolkien wrote first. In his own words, the fall of Gondolin is the first real story of this imaginary world. Bilbo Baggins will not exist for decades. Nor will Frodo, nor will Gandalf, nor will Gollum or the One Ring. Even Feanor and the Silmarils and Beren and Luthien and Turin Turambar haven't quite yet settled in his imagination. But as the First World War rages and memories of very real death, decay and destruction swirl about in Tolkien's mind, he begins the story of the end of Gondolin, the first great tale of his legendarium. And here's the thing, it is completely finished. When I say Gondolin is an unfinished tale, I don't mean Tolkien never got to the ending, he started at the ending. What I mean is, in the 56 years between writing that ending and the end of his life, he never came back to it. There is no updated version of Gondolin's fall. It is one of the most important events in all the legends of the Elder Days, and yet the only complete account that we possess is the very first one, written in the darkest days of the First World War. Now, I cannot stress enough how awesome this original story is, but I do need to flag one thing in advance. It doesn't necessarily fit with every other part of the mythology that follows. You know, the elves of 1917 aren't quite the elves that we know from The Lord of the Rings and the later Silmarillion. Same with Balrogs. I'll get into those details when we get there, but there will be a few moments, maybe later in the story, that might make you, raise an eyebrow. That said though, I do not want to overstate this point. Despite the age of the Fall of Gondolin story, with a little bit of imagination, this ending is, I think, entirely compatible with pretty much everything Tolkien wrote after it. You know, characters like Glorfindel, Ecthelion of the Fountain, and King Turgon only grew in majesty as Tolkien kept building the world around them. And it's genuinely fascinating to see just how much of Middle-earth survived intact from its earliest origins. Decades later, while writing The Hobbit, Tolkien will have his new wizard character, Gandalf, pull an elvish sword from a troll's treasure hoard. And when Professor Tolkien sits down to write the history of that sword, Glamdring, his mind will wander back to Gondolin. We are told explicitly in The Hobbit that Glamdring once belonged to the King of Gondolin, a character we are going to get to know very, very well over the course of this series. Similarly, in early drafts of the Council of Elrond chapter in The Lord of the Rings, we are told outright that Glorfindel, the elven lord who rescues Frodo from the Nazgul, is the very same Glorfindel who fought at Gondolin. Despite how old this original story is, or perhaps because of it, the historical event of Gondolin's fall will loom over thousands and thousands of years to come. But I am getting well ahead of myself. Before we can arrive at the destruction of this great city, first we need to talk about its rise, its splendor, and its people. And to tell those stories, I'm going to draw from quite a few different sources. In the next episode, I will cover how Gondolin was founded, how something came from nothing, and I'll use material from the 13th and 15th chapters of the Silmarillion, writings that Christopher Tolkien stitched together from multiple sources after his father's death. The majority of that material was composed around 1951, so shortly after The Lord of the Rings was finished, and decades after the original Fall of Gondolin was written. But there are a handful of brilliant details from that original 1917 version that didn't make it into the Silmarillion, but do flesh the story out beautifully, and don't really contradict any later writings, so I will bring those in too, for, the full Tolkien Untangled experience. However, I will try to be clear about which details are coming from the imagination of Tolkien in his 20s, and which came decades later from the mind of a 60-year-old professor. Anyway, after talking about its origins, the second of Gondolin's 4 seasons, its 4 stories, is a fascinating, self-contained little tale about the most sinister elf ever to exist. We are going to meet the darkest dark elf in Middle-earth's history. And honestly, there is no one else quite like him. If you're already familiar with the Silmarillion, and you've watched all the episodes in this First Age Explained series, You will have probably noticed that way back when I was talking about the original founding of Nargothrond and the first coming of men into Beleriand, there is one chapter between those two things that I completely skipped over. Some people have asked if I'm ever going to get to it. Well, with this Gondolin series, the answer is finally yes. The story of Eol, the darkest elf who ever lived, and his fascinating son, Maeglin, is a crucially important legend of the Elder Days. But the whole thing is intimately tied up with a character known as the White Lady of Gondolin. And I decided it makes a lot more sense for me to tell her story here as part of this series, rather than like 4 years ago when I was covering the other tales set at around the same time. This story of the Darkest Elf is fairly unique among the tales of the Silmarillion. As I've explained, most of the chapters in the Silmarillion are derived either from what Tolkien wrote in the 1950s or from older texts dating back to like the 1930s or even earlier. But Tolkien wrote most of the manuscript for chapter 16 in 1970, only 3 years before he died. The tale of the Dark Elves, Eol and Maeglin, and of the White Lady of Gondolin stands out because it is by far the most recently written chapter in the entire Silmarillion. But here's what I find so interesting. The version of their story in the Silmarillion was penned around 1970, but the earliest versions of that same story were conceived shortly after the original Fall of Gondolin back in 1917. And all things considered, with the exception of a few names, the 1970 version really isn't all that different from the one written almost an entire lifetime earlier. Clearly, the tale of the Dark Elf is something that lived in Tolkien's mind relatively unchanged for over 50 years. It really is unlike any other chapter in the Silmarillion. Anyway, when I've told that story, it will be time to move on to the third of Gondolin's 4 seasons, another fan favourite that I've been dying to talk about for years. It is the tale of the cousin of the Children of Húrin. And whereas the Children of Húrin is like the darkest and most depressing thing Tolkien ever wrote, the story of their cousin is nothing short of mind-blowing. I know I say that quite a lot on this channel, but I genuinely do think this is one of the joint coolest parts of the entire Legendarium. Get excited for a guy called Tuor. But just to make things nice and complicated, in the Silmarillion, the tale of Tuor is told in its entirety in 9 pages. They are good pages, it's a cool story, but it is not the tale of Tuor. For that, for the full extended edition, we need to put down our copies of the Silmarillion and pick up the unfinished tales. Because the tale of Tuor is another one of those foundational pillars holding up the Legendarium. And like so many of the other foundational pillars, it exists in several different versions that changed quite a bit over the span of Tolkien's lifetime. Way back in 1917, while recovering from the horrors of the war, Tolkien wrote the earliest version of Tuor's story. It's phenomenal, it's highly mythological in style, but just like the rest of the original Fall of Gondolin, there are a few elements that don't quite mesh with the later legends that we're all familiar with. However, unlike every other version of the Tuor story, this original one is completely finished. It has a full narrative arc, beginning, middle, and end. In the 1920s, Tolkien returned to the story of Tuor and the Hidden City, and he tried to condense, alter, and update his greatest legend. He began an alliterative poem called The Lay of the Fall of Gondolin, and he wrote brief summaries of the story to weave into his wider legendarium. But then, many years later, in 1951, after finishing The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien began an entirely new version of the tale of Tuor. an astounding epic that reads like the opening of an unforgettable novel. It is the grandest version of the story, the most immersive one, giving us more depth and detail than pretty much any other legend of the Elder Days, except maybe the Children of Húrin. Vivid dialogue, intricate world building, breathtaking scenes that are honestly unrivaled anywhere else in the Legendarium. And without wanting to give too much away too early, fundamentally this is a quest story. Tuor is given a task, and his tale is all about him trying to accomplish it. For 35 pages, he journeys onward, meets some hugely important characters, faces trials and tribulations, and then, just as he arrives at the place he's destined to get to, just as he meets the person he's meant to meet, just as his tale reaches the pinnacle it's been building to and starts to shift into something else entirely, hinting at the epicness still to come, Tolkien just stopped. He gave up. The manuscript ends, the story breaks off effectively mid-sentence, and he never came back to it. It's one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in fantasy literature. So why did he abandon this wonderful new version so abruptly? Well, the 1950s were not an easy time for Tolkien creatively. By 1951, he had just spent 12 years writing, rewriting, and perfecting The Lord of the Rings, a book that he self-mockingly described as an impractical monster, made all the more monstrous by the fact that what his publishers actually wanted was effectively The Hobbit 2, a sequel to a children's story about hobbits and wizards and magic rings. Instead, Tolkien wrote his most famous masterpiece, and when it was done, he reflected, "Now I look at it, the magnitude of the disaster is apparent to me. My work has escaped my control, and I have produced a monster. An immensely long, complex, rather bitter, and very terrifying romance, quite unfit for children, if fit for anybody. And it is not really a sequel to The Hobbit, but to the Silmarillion." On that final point, Tolkien was defiant. The Lord of the Rings should not exist without the Silmarillion, which, of course, had not yet been written in its final form. He viewed the two as a single, indivisible work. One requires the other for the world to truly come to life. He often said that the legends of the First Age and the Lord of the Rings were really one long saga of the jewels and the rings. To which his publishers said, very politely, "Nope, absolutely not. That is insane. Paper was expensive. Ink was expensive. Rationing was still in effect. The Second World War had only ended 6 years earlier, and The Lord of the Rings was already an outrageous monster to submit, considering The Hobbit 2 was all it actually asked for. The idea of bolting on an entire second tome and publishing the two together as the biggest story ever told was completely out of the question. Also, he had just spent 12 years writing The Lord of the Rings. How long would it take to write a Silmarillion in that same style? It simply wasn't feasible. And so, crushed and discouraged, Tolkien's creative momentum stalled. His enthusiasm slowly burned out. He set the new Gondolin manuscript aside, and he never found the energy to pick it back up again. Which for us fans is devastating. But let me give you a sense of the scale that Tolkien was up against here. Remember how I said the updated 1950s Tale of Tuor covers 35 pages? Well, those pages are only expanding a fraction of the full 1917 story. If Tolkien had done to the rest of the original Gondolin narrative what he did to its opening pages, the updated 1950s Fall of Gondolin could have been a full novel in its own right. And Gondolin is only one story of the Silmarillion. He would then have had to do the same for Beren and Luthien, and then the Children of Húrin, and the Tale of Feanor, and Fingolfin, and Thingol and Melian. And Gondolin isn't even the last story of the Silmarillion. There's still one more to go after it. I think, in 1951, Tolkien realized just how wide the gulf was between what he wanted to achieve and what was actually possible. He was forced to admit that Gondolin would always have to remain, to some extent, locked away inside his own imagination. And so, we, his readers, have to accept that all we can do is peer at his vast hidden kingdom through a keyhole and glimpse only a fraction of its true magnitude. However, please don't let what I just said there give you the wrong impression. If you're worried that this series is just gonna kind of fizzle out into an anticlimax, don't be. If you're afraid the Fall of Gondolin never gets a satisfying conclusion, I have good news. That original 1917 version still exists. The original 1917 version is finished, and the original 1917 version is astonishingly awesome. It's older than pretty much anything else I've ever covered on this channel. You can feel the torment of the trenches in its bones, but I promise you, it will not disappoint. So, forget everything you think you know about Middle-earth. Forget the whimsy of The Hobbit, forget Tom Bombadil, forget the innocence of the Shire, forget wizards, forget magical rings. This is going to blow all of that out of the water. It's going to be bold, bloody, and brutal, but also beautiful, profound, and totally awe-inspiring. And I could not be more excited to spend the rest of this series exploring exactly why people love it so much. Get hyped for the rise and fall of the Dark Lord's greatest threat. Middle-earth's mightiest city of the Elder Days, the last bastion of resistance against Morgoth's empire. A kingdom hidden from the eyes of the world. A story born in the trenches of the Somme. A story of glory, of betrayal, of hope, and of ruin. Welcome to the greatest of Tolkien's great tales. Welcome to Gondolin. So, to make sure you don't miss any of the awesomeness still to come in this series, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. You can also now support the channel on Patreon or on Ko-fi if you'd like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you are at all interested. And a great big thank you to everyone who's already donated. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Nevair Melanine.